Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, far from being a boring status quo kind of a year, frankly, 2012 was a thrill ride, socially, politically, and economically. Welcome to the most widely watched source for Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and on this special end-of-year, two-part series, we get to pick apart and analyze how all of the past year's excitement affect us and will reverberate into the next year and beyond. And we are joined by four of our regular economic and public policy experts. And the fun begins in just a moment.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded December 13th, 2012. On this week's program, Dr. Frank Hefner of the College of Charleston, Dr. Matthew Martin of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Dr. John Silvia of Wells Fargo, and Dr. Douglas Woodward of the University of South Carolina. Now, Chris William.
Well, happy holidays. Welcome to our program. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, happy holidays.
Just generally happy.
Hopefully.
Yes.
It was a good year.
Yeah.
Was it a good year?
It was for South Carolina. I don't know about North Carolina.
Well, no, let's start with that, Doug, since you kind of leaned into that. Was it a good year by the numbers? Was it how you thought it was going to work out?
We predicted last year that we would have 2% job growth, and people thought that was optimistic. It turned out to be pretty much right on the mark for South Carolina. Now, North Carolina is not anywhere near that. So we had a surprisingly good year, but we predicted that, and we're seeing the same thing going forward. Is we got a lot of momentum in the South Carolina right now in terms of jobs.
So how does the year over year in the Tar Heel State, how does that unfold?
It unfolds pretty positively. In terms, I agree with Doug, it's not as strong as South Carolina. I think North Carolina still have a lot of structural issues with the employment situation. It's a very diverse state, and we do have the education problem. We have a lot of the low-skilled, semi-skilled manufacturing challenges. I think South Carolina sort of upped their game in terms of value-added. I think that's a good point of departure between the two states. But there's an improvement, and I think, I agree in general. You know, the economy continues to move ahead on the national level, and we're getting beyond the point, I think, of worrying about, are we still in the doldrums of 2008, 2009. I think we've made some good progress.
This sounds kind of interesting that it seems like the tables have turned here. It used to be that South Carolina would look at North Carolina and say, gosh, you guys are strong, you're bigger. But now it seems, Frank, is this the case that South Carolina is hitting on all cylinders where North Carolina might need a little tune-up? Have the tables turned from the fact of the unemployment number? Have the tables turned back from the manufacturing sector with Boeing and of course, all the expansionary projects? How do you take that?
Well, I think everyone could use a tune-up. We're doing better. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean our structural problems have disappeared. And John alluded to some of the ones you have in North Carolina also in terms of educational issues, labor force issues, and other issues. What we benefited from primarily was the increase in manufacturing and being a manufacturing-intensive state.
Where did that come from?
But it was value-added manufacturing.
Yeah, value-added
Like
manufacturing.
For instance?
Autos. Autos
right.
are just huge this year. And we think also with 2013, we had 2,000 announced 2,000 jobs, new jobs on already a base of 30,000 in South Carolina. It's auto parts. It's not, BMW's expanding, but the auto parts are coming in. We're seeing transmissions, ball bearing plants spread around the state. So that is truly forming as a cluster in South Carolina right now. And that was a big part of what led to this renewal of manufacturing. And it's been a focus of our state. We didn't give up on that.
I'm sorry. We've always been a manufacturing state. Unfortunately, in the past, historically, it was textiles. And as that declined, it's taken us a long time to replace that with a more diversified manufacturing base. And, to some extent we have. And the economy worldwide improved somewhat last year. The question is, moving forward, what's going to happen? Because so much of this is going overseas, so much of it's going to other areas of the country. Is it sustainable? But right now, we have a nice base that we can be very happy with.
We just can't have the fact that you are both agreeing on something, because
That's all right.
that can't stand.
That will change, believe me.
Matt,
When we talk about the fiscal situation in
That's
Washington.
true. And once we get into politics, the gloves are
It's
right there.
coming. It's coming. Matt, how do you feel about this manufacturing issue? There's been a lot of talk the last decade about all these jobs have gone offshore, but it seems like some of this is now being repatriated, if not back to the U.S., certainly back to North America at a pretty good clip.
Yeah, it's of a different form, though. So to pick up the theme of what happened in North Carolina, the loss of the legacy industries, you're seeing some of that come back, but in a much different form. And there's one case in North Carolina of a furniture plant reopening, but with sort of state-of-the-art technology, many fewer workers. So the sort of the value of production is holding up quite nicely, but it's not ever going to employ the same number of workers. So
It's the same with textiles. Textiles is coming back in the Carolinas.
Right.
It's just not employing as many workers. It's highly productive. We're seeing mills expand, though,
Yeah.
in terms of output.
See, big plants now are not big in terms of people. They're large in terms of value added. They're large in terms of what they're producing, and that's a change. And that's a positive sign in the long run. You want economic growth to take place like that.
You all seem, I have to say this, last year you were a bit dour, and from time to time you've all been on the program separately, and you have not been quite as optimistic sounding as you sound now. Is that
Well,
is that
I'll tell
accurate?
you why I'm optimistic. The Federal Reserve of Philadelphia rates all states, or actually has a leading index for all states. They're the only ones that do it. South Carolina is way ahead of the pack going into 2013. They're predicting a 4.5% increase in the leading indicators, and nobody else is even close to
Is
that.
is state business and public policy people, are they celebrating that? Do they know that's the case?
I'm starting to tell them. I don't think they read the Federal Reserve reports. But I think they sense the economy really has shored up and is doing well, and at least in South Carolina.
Yeah.
But
John?
again, Chris, it sort of brings in that labor force challenge that we've talked about before. Yes, manufacturing is rising and productivity is fine. You're producing a lot of value added, but you're just not using a lot of workers to do it. So again, we see that development continuing in these states where there's a big challenge in terms of workforce development.
And there are even in places where jobs are showing up in some of the higher skilled supportive industries, think of machinists, welders, those sorts of things, there's a shortage of workers in those areas. So that I wouldn't suggest that's a huge number of jobs, but it's something of a restraint on growth.
It's the biggest challenge for Boeing in Charleston, right? Just finding workers right now, skilled.
Are those
workers.
high-paying jobs?
They pay above the state average.
Yes.
They pay less than they do in Everett, Washington.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where they're unionized.
So when you say they're higher, not necessarily high.
What is this whole, and Doug, I think you might have been quoted on this recently about this whole idea, the unemployment rate in South Carolina ticked down a little bit, but that was because a lot of people just gave up looking.
Yeah.
And you said you didn't understand the psychology of that.
Yeah.
Why not? I mean, here are people that are exasperated.
Right.
Why wouldn't you understand that?
Well, because the job market's improving. We expect that will draw more people into the job market. It's more likely they can find a job, but they're staying out of the labor market entirely. And we're puzzled by why young people wouldn't at least be looking now for jobs when there's these opportunities that we're talking about.
What's the anomaly there? How do you look at that, John?
Well, in part, I think you just have to split the labor force in terms of the skills that they have. But I would agree with Doug. It is an anomaly that the younger generation is the generation where the participation rate has really fallen off. Now, part of it simply may be education, but that's the point in your career where you're really getting going and you're developing some experience. I think on the other side, we are losing some of both men and women in the demographics of the baby boom, because that group is retiring and leaving early. So there is
Because of their prospects, you think, or because they feel like they can leave early?
I think they can leave early. I think that more and more it seems like there are some people who are. And again, when we deal with American society, we're dealing with many different groups within that society. So there isn't one story that fits all the people in America or in North or South Carolina. It's a very, very diverse labor force. And I would agree with Doug, the strange and the problem for us is that young people are not participating in the labor force, not getting that experience. And the evidence, at least academically that I've seen, is that impacts lifetime earnings.
Yeah.
So
It's
why
a
aren't you
huge
getting in the
problem.
game?
If they don't have work experience, how are they going to get in the labor force?
Right.
You know, if they've been out for 10 years and they're young, they're now looking at, 25 or 26 years old and with very little work experience. Nobody's going to want to hire them. There are job openings, but they just don't have the background.
So I think then as a public policy issue, in terms of our junior colleges and colleges in general, that is their challenge right now, is to really develop that workforce and to see what's going on.
So parents, don't let the college kids come back home.
Right.
Speaking for yourself?
Right, yeah. Put them back in the job market.
College
Get
professor.
them, get some job experience.
If you are watching, this is a part one of a special two-part series of our economic and public policy experts. We are focusing on 2012. On part two, we're going to look more ahead past the fiscal cliff, past some of the very public budget and public policy negotiations on part two. But right now, it's important for you to know that this program was taped prior to a solid decision on fiscal cliff and what will they exactly do there. But I do want to come back to the public policy, and especially around education. Matt, you guys at the Fed have this whole idea of financial literacy, and I know kind of how that works. But let's talk about education. And John makes a good point. The junior colleges, the higher ed, the four-year universities and colleges. Tom Ross, president of the University of North Carolina system, was on this board or on this program, and he vocalized what many people say, and that is, maybe not everybody should be going to a higher. Maybe not everybody should have a four-year degree. So I guess my question is, how is policy as you see it? How do we lean into very budget and lean times? How do we make sure we make that investment in education and let that bubble up into business development?
Yeah, so I think part of it is an informational issue. We have parents and sort of the general view is to get ahead, you need to go to a four-year program, get out, find a job, and that's get on your career path. And as we've been discussing, that there's some links that aren't working very well in that process. In the meantime, you have a bit of a step up in some of these middle skill manufacturing, other jobs where you work with your hands. And so the sort of the mix of what we need in the labor force has changed a bit. And it's going to require probably a little bit more
Political courage?
Political courage, but also informational knowledge. I don't think a lot of parents understand really where the prospects are in the job market, and they're going to have trouble sort of guiding their kids in the right way. Their default will be college is the best opportunity to do that, and that's not always going to be the case.
So Frank, I guess how do you lean into the State House in Columbia and make sure that they truly do understand? And is it something that needs to be understood about making the early investment in education to get kids, to get people retrained, to get them back into the system, to make sure that this education does blossom into economic development? How do you make that case and have them have the political courage to stroke the pen, to make sure that education gets more investment in very tough times?
You're asking an impossible question. How do we get the General Assembly to understand? So, but anyway, that's the whole issue on education and the connection between education and economic development is so unobservable in some cases that.
It seems obvious.
Well, yes and no, because so many people think that you need a four-year college degree, whereas maybe a two-year degree in a trade area would work. But we need to revamp our education from kindergarten on up, and that's not been the focus, and so that needs to be changed. But see, when we start talking about those kind of issues, we're talking about something that's looking at 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And what the general consensus is we want to solve problems for this year, next year, and that's it. And so that's a little bit too far down the line for them to think about, I think, in some cases. And the returns are uncertain. and as a result, they're not willing to put the money and effort into it.
But they're generally positive. So I'd add early
They
childhood.
are very positive.
I would add early childhood education to
Very
that continuum.
positive, very
The one
positive.
area where it is visible is in economic development. So when a company wants to come into the state and they have a particular workforce need, they're probably going to work with the local community college. And that, I think elected officials see that very clearly, and there's a lot of support for that sort of development. It's an important piece of the puzzle.
I have to say this, my wife just retired, took early retirement.
And that's a good thing, right?
As a teacher.
Yes.
Yes, because teaching became so difficult over the last few years. A lot of people don't know this, but I heard this day to day. And when she started some 25 years ago at good school, it was a great job. She loved it, kids were engaged. But over the last few years, it just became so difficult for her. Every day she was beaten down. The kids are really rebelling in a way against education. You got 30% in her classes who just won't even open their book. And do nothing. So it became so frustrated she had to leave. I don't mean to be pessimistic. This is a really tough challenge. Not
Is that
for everybody. I'm not the ones going to college, but we've got a core of people, and I'm sure this is true across the country, that have totally disengaged from education.
and not to pigeonhole your wife into this, but is that a one-off on how your wife feels about it, or
Oh,
is that
no,
much
you hear it from
broader?
all
No, no, no,
teachers.
yeah.
All teachers
The
are
recent
facing this.
report on how we rank compared to other countries, once again, on math and sciences, where do we stand on that?
Well, I'll tell you, actually, they did have a recent report on that. That North Carolina actually was rating up with South Korea and Singapore in
In
terms
what
of
way?
reading tests,
Right.
international reading tests. I was surprised by that. It just came out in December. So
And what about South Carolina?
they didn't do so well.
Yeah.
But I can understand North Carolina.
Yeah.
Maybe North Carolina was good about choosing who was taking that test. Just having the best students.
Let's shift here a little bit. In North Carolina, there's a new sheriff in town, so to
Yes,
speak, in
sir.
the governor's mansion, and business seems to be pretty excited about the fact that Governor-elect McCrory now is in there, but also, John, that this whole idea that the Republicans both control the House and the Senate, and there seems to be the triumphant here of going forward. Is North Carolina going to be business friendly? Is that the feeling you get? What's your clinical take on this?
My clinical take is a little bit more business friendly, but I think like any administration that comes in and basically runs the show, it's always a question of moderate reform, thoughtful reform, not radical reform. And I think there will be some improvements, and I think there will be some questions raised about how the state spends money, particularly with incentives. I think they'll be looking at some type of tax reform or tax changes overall. But for the state as a whole, it's always a question. I think good government is one of modest change, thoughtful change, not radical change. So I think it'll be more business friendly. But the problems in the state are more than just business. Again, going back to education, workforce development, dealing with the infrastructure in the state. I think there are a lot of issues here. And also, I think finally, Chris, the bottom line is, as you hinted at earlier, Frank, there is a limit on the budget. The state is not growing like it did the last 20 years. Therefore, our revenue growth is going to be more limited. Therefore, we have to make very careful decisions with respect to incentives and subsidies, tax reform, and just general spending. And particularly in the state of North Carolina, it's that delicate balance between Medicaid spending and higher education spending, and then a little bit of infrastructure spending, and how those priorities are set are going to determine the path for the state going forward.
There seems to be, and Matt, I'd like to bring you in on this, and then John, I'm going to come back to you on
Yeah.
this because I know you have an opinion. North Carolina's been talking. Some of the public policy people in North Carolina have been talking about that. Now is the time for North Carolina to take hold of this tax reform idea. I mean, real tax reform. I would say radical tax reform, to go from the current structure that they have to a consumption-based tax, much like Tennessee, much like Florida, and have no income tax. How do you come down on that? Do you think is that something that North Carolina can do now? Does it work? Has it worked in those other states?
So I think they can do it. There's always transition issues, right? How do you walk from one tax system to another and make that adjustment without too much disruption? I think that's one issue. The other issue, though, is it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? We have the national policy issues that are ongoing, and they'll play a distinct role. John mentioned the Medicare part of it. We still have states still have to make decisions about their participation in certain parts of it and how those exchanges and other are going to work. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I think there's a fair amount of uncertainty about how how that all plays out.
Well,
in the coming
Medicaid's a
years.
big issue in our state this year. I mean, we're not going to go into the have a state exchange. Looking at a national exchange.
And why do you
now.
think Governor Haley decided not to participate? Was that the part of the Tea Party DNA, or is there something else there?
Oh, you'd have to ask her, but probably that has a lot to do with it. And also, the fact is that why not have the national government set up the exchange? We don't have to get involved in that unless we have some particular reason other states do.
You mean in lieu of state by state by state?
Yeah, there's going to be a national exchange. It's probably the quickest way to get universal health care, I would say. And the other big piece of it, though, is the Medicaid. You can cover under Obamacare up to 138% of the poverty level, and people under Medicaid, and the federal government will pay for that up front, 100%. And we're now on record as in South Carolina rejecting that.
Yeah, I don't want to get in. We're going to get into that in part 2 of the Obamacare in 2013. But I want to come back to the idea, John, with you specifically, that North Carolina legislators are talking more about tax reform, talking about going to consumption-based, no income tax. Will that work? What are the landmines?
It can work. I think the bottom line, the number one landmine to me is what are you going to do about food? Are you going to exempt food at the grocery store? Does that create a distortion in terms of food away from home, in terms of restaurant pricing? But it is, how do you make a consumption tax somewhat progressive rather than just a flat consumption tax overall? Because I think you need to make it a little bit more progressive and sort of exempt certain types of spending, maybe clothing. But the landmine, again, continues. You're going to have an incredible number of interest groups who want to have their product exempt from the consumption tax. And then finally, what do you do about the state sales tax as well as the consumption tax? How do you define that too? Because as you know, there's a huge issue with services. And once you get into that question about, okay, now I'm going to go to my attorney, or now I'm going to go to my accountant, my tax accountant for my annual tax review to fill out my IRS forms, are you going to start imposing taxes on that? So I think those are the landmines we have to look at.
Do you have any idea how Tennessee and Florida do that now?
No.
Yeah.
That's absolutely amazing when you think about some of these tax scenarios, and that for how many years have we said we're a service-based economy, but we don't calculate how to work that into the tax formulas, and so we have all these loopholes in that, and so you end up with a consumption tax or a sales tax, but it ends up being a narrower base.
Because consumer spending habits have changed over the years.
Right.
Some people buy fertilizer. Okay, that would be taxed. But if you pay somebody to take care of your lawn, is that not going to be taxed? And that's where the trick is in terms of what your exemptions are. And as consumer spending has changed over the years, people who weren't taxed and thought that was the natural way now become more and more perceived as that's a loophole. And that's going to be one of the great challenges in terms of where we're going.
South Carolina business leaders have been trying now for 10 years
To change that model?
to change the model and to bring overall sales tax rates down, broaden the base, get rid of the exemptions. There's been study after study after study. It's been presented to the legislature, but they just can't bring it up to vote.
And what do the studies show, Doug? That it would be more effective, it'd be better for the state?
Oh, yeah, more efficient, more effective, less distortions.
Economists agree on that. Broaden the base, lower the rates.
Is that the problem?
The problem is the politicians. Everybody wants their own group
because
exempt.
the lobbyists come out of the woodwork
Yeah.
on this as soon as it happens. It
Please
happens
exempt
every
us.
time they make a proposal.
So again, to ask the question, is it about political courage? Is that what it is?
Well, it ends up being, in one sense, just as a flip comment, though, taking off on your comment, yes, where economists typically agree on a policy with different perspectives in political arenas, where we all agree this is a good idea, no one listens to us. So instead, they go to some other bases and other forms of policies. So where we typically uniformly say this is the best way to do it, hardly anyone follows us.
I think it's because the trade-offs aren't obvious, right? So we tend to talk about the tax revenues in isolation without connecting them to the services you expect from that level of government and how you can better provide those services. And I think if we could maybe economists need to do a better job of
Right.
more explicitly laying out the opportunity cost for,
But to
for
take
one
a
Real
course of action or the
consequences
other.
here too.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to raise the tax on food, if it's exempt now and then you're going to go off of that, you're hitting a lot of people, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of voters out there. The politicians
well,
are
that
caught in
changes
that.
the- that makes it regressive real
we have
fast.
two
Yeah.
parts of this program, and we're going to keep the fun and the momentum going. We're out of time. Gentlemen, kind of hang with us here. And thank you for watching our program. If you have any comments, go to carolinabusinessreview.com. Next week. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.